This is from Chapter 3 of the book Roadmaps to World Class that I wrote, Dr. Stephen Starling. The SCORE process is designed to assess organizations on one or more of the world-class management step charts from Drive. Each chart is analyzed in a separate engagement. So if your company has selected 8 step charts to assess itself on, then you would have to set up 8 engagements with 8 teams of managers. Assessment teams are facilitated by a driver who inputs the attribute scores. Other group members on the teams for the engagements are assigned as reviewers, and these are usually managers within the organization. The SCORE process has 5 phases, the first of which is the same as in the acronym SCORE. And in fact, SCORE itself is an acronym, so the 5 phases are based upon S, C, O, R, and E. In the SCORE phase, each of the attributes is scored by a driver. Now, the reason why we do this is so that we don't have, say, 30 people involved in actually scoring a chart right off the bat. What we do is we have the scoring happen from a centralized point with one individual, maybe consulting with other people in the organization. And certainly that probably would have to occur. But then we move to what is called consensus. We have found that it's a lot easier for managers in industry to go in and critique what somebody else has said about their organization and have that as the starting point for the true assessment. So in the consensus phase, reviewers will actually rate the attribute scores the driver gave, and thereby influencing the final score through ratings and then discussion. Now, the actual discussion doesn't take place in consensus, it takes place in Optimize. In Optimize, the scores with insufficient ratings that were given by the reviewers in the consensus phase are discussed. This type of discussion can be online or actually face-to-face in meetings. The scores then are modified by the driver, not by reviewers, based upon these discussions. Then we move to the review phase. And essentially this is the point where the driver takes the optimized assessment of each step chart and then publishes it. And the chart itself, in terms of what we call it, is a chart report that then will go into a larger report called the SCORE report. So from review to engage, we could have, in the case of the example I might have mentioned before, which was 8 step charts, could go into essentially this SCORE report. Then the SCORE report can be sent to the audit, roadmap, and the robust processes. And this is where the idea of engage occurs, in the fact that here now we've decided this is our assessment, we're completed with it. Now we need to either make sure that it's correct and remove the bias from it, which is what the audit process will do, and or move straight to or past the audit process and go straight to the roadmap process and start engaging with our divisions and business units in developing an enterprise roadmap. Finally, our other choice is to go and start to work with our alliance members in the robust process. A little review of the organization frontier is useful because essentially SCORE is what gets us to the organization frontier. And the goal of most organizations when they engage in the SCORE process itself is to maximize the organization's efficient frontier. So what is it that exactly happens to the efficient frontier, or could happen to the efficient frontier if indeed the managers are active in their assessment process? Well, what happens is that the frontier itself starts to go above the current knowledge that they have with the existing project portfolio possibilities in the original efficient frontier. The reason for this is because just the process essentially of assessment leads one to understanding what the gaps are between world-class, which is what we're showing here in this slide, world-class frontier, and your existing frontier. Through that process, inevitably you'll discover or identify potential projects for improvement. Some of them might be very quick and easy to do that would increase your return with the same amount of management hours. So in other words, your portfolio, the optimal portfolio, the best portfolio possible, would go higher above the original point it was with the original efficient frontier. So what are some of the benefits of SCORE besides just simply expanding the frontier? Well, one of the things we've discovered is even if we don't develop roadmaps, managers gain a tremendous amount of insight from self-assessment using step charts. Most organizations do not have roadmaps, so if indeed we were to move beyond the assessment to roadmaps, then we certainly could gain more benefit. Now, if companies do have their own roadmap, they're certainly excited to compare their roadmap against what the step charts reveal in terms of the gaps. This check then allows for them to check their existing roadmap for completeness. The outcome is a new understanding of possible projects and initiatives the organization could undertake to progress to world class. Now, a question that might be arising in a lot of people's minds is why the focus on core competencies? Now, we already addressed a little bit of this in Chapter 1, the idea of focusing in on capabilities that essentially span over core competencies and versus, say, performance measures. But let's take a look at just the idea of core competencies. World-class organizations are not functionally or even business unit centric. They tend to focus on optimization of the entire enterprise, or at least they should. We hope that this is the case. Beyond enterprise optimization is another level of optimization, and this level has not been fully tapped by organizations. It's somewhat hidden. And by hidden, we mean the fact that when we've gone out and we've engaged with companies and we ask them, what are the benefits you're getting from your alliances and your collaborative relationships? And they have a hard time really figuring out what those particular benefits are. Now, when we put up a list, for example, of all the benefits we believe they should be getting out of it, they can check off very, very few of those opportunities. So it tends to be an eye-opening experience. And so that's why we call this essentially a hidden level of optimization, and that's the collaboration with the alliances. Optimization of alliances recognizes that core competencies span not only the functional areas or silos, but also enterprises and alliances. In fact, we can pictorially see this essentially with this particular figure, as we can see the arrows essentially of perhaps processes and core competencies spanning over the functional silos. Almost anybody within any of these different core competency areas could think of an example. In cost management, for example, if you want to measure total cost of ownership, it cannot be done just by accounting and finance, and certainly it can't be done just by supply chain. Everybody that has any kind of touch to whatever it is you're measuring with total cost of ownership contributes in one way or another to the cost. So many processes and certainly the core competencies of the organization span over the functional areas. But it doesn't end there. Core competencies span business units and divisions. And core competencies span chains and alliances. So let's take a quick look at how we develop these charts around the core competencies. First, we did a literature review, and that's uncovering everything we could find that was already published out there in the world, including internet searches and so forth. We also then solicited faculty for contributions. Initially, the faculty that were solicited were primarily in the United States. Now, we've expanded this, and now we have what we call think tanks, I'll bring up in just a minute, that are composed of faculty from around the world. Then we did industry reviews in terms of having managers, key managers from industry actually look at the charts and give us feedback on it. Then we did faculty reviews. And faculty reviews is different than, say, contributions. Contributions are where you ask for a faculty member to please look over the attributes and are there some that you would add to this particular chart or some that you would remove, and then you have a dialogue and a discussion. A faculty review is different in the fact that essentially the faculty member is critiquing it. And we had many opportunities at conferences and having colleagues even coming to the university where I was at previously to have a look essentially at the existing charts and critique them. We also use them in university courses, in particular master's program classes at the University of San Diego. The best feedback we had actually was from the online courses, such as the ones that we currently offer through the Roadmaps Institute. At the University of San Diego, we had the great fortune of having middle management from some of the best companies in the world coming into our supply chain program. And as a result, we were able to get incredible feedback on some of the step charts. Then, of course, this is where the rubber meets the road. If you go out and you actually use the charts for assessments. In particular, Raytheon Company, we did assessments at multiple divisions. Most of the United States divisions, certainly, even in Raytheon Australia, and we had some assessment going on in Ireland and Scotland also. Now, with respect to assessments, if you took a look at the section on acknowledgments, you would have noted there have been over 70 companies that have done the assessments. In many cases, that was just one company doing one chart and giving us feedback. But certainly having those assessments has helped to make the charts better over the years. The next step, I think, is the biggest step of all in development of these charts, and that's validation by core competency think tanks. And at the point of my doing this voiceover, we have formed the think tanks, and they are going to be starting at the end of 2006. In any case, the idea is to bring together people from industry who are leaders and also from academia from the top Financial Times top 100 business schools. In fact, just a quick pictorial look at what we're going to be doing with these faculty members and industry leaders. We're going to be having an annual think tank conference sponsored by the Roadmaps Institute, where the focus is going to be twofold on focusing in on the upper part of this figure on developing the industry's drive models, and then in the bottom part, developing the core competency models. So this is of interest to a lot of faculty members from around the world and industry leaders, because the fact that what we're focusing in on is so broad and holistic. And the online environment that this think tank is going to be, think tank conference at least, is going to be within, is allowing for an unprecedented ability to collaborate. And then one of the nice things about an online situation is that everything that is discussed ends up in typeset. Well, down at the bottom is where you can see the core competency think tank rooms. Now, these aren't really physical rooms, these are virtual rooms. And the faculty and industry leaders within these particular think tanks are going to be able to go out and work with the open think tanks in the open forum and be able to extend their knowledge there too. But ultimately, the decisions on what the step charts are year in, year out will be decided upon behind closed doors by this select set of experts. I just wanted to throw up quickly some of the attributes from a couple of the step charts. I just randomly chose these and stuck them into the slide. But essentially, we need to understand that at the very disaggregated level of drive are these attributes. And these attributes are what get assessed within organizations and then ultimately roll up to their drive scores. And then these drive scores are compared across industries, for example, and even can be rolled up to a regional metric like for an entire country or even an entire continent for comparison purposes. Now, there's a tremendous amount of bias in these types of roll-ups of data, but you know, there's a kind of saying out there that you're better off to have some information rather than none at all. And that's a very poor way for me to rephrase that saying. But in any case, I think you get the idea. So we're going to come back and revisit these attributes and actually do a pseudo assessment of them here in a little bit. Let's take a look at the idea of scoring the attributes, and in particular the color coding. Let's not necessarily focus on the numerical rating at this point, but just the colors. Now, Of course, because we have a driving theme to the entire model of drive, we are leveraging once again this idea of the stoplight colors. A green capability in the center of the slide means that we have that capability. It's fully implemented. We believe that there's nothing else we really can do or add to make this capability better. So we're completely content with it, and we give it a green, which means it's got 100% of a capability score. Now, if there's a shade of gray below that, in terms of the fact that we have a capability, but we don't really feel like it has been implemented fully, or that we could do some more development of that, then we would give it a yellow score. In contrast to capability scores is the idea of a priority score. So with the priority score, if we were to give the capability a 0, in other words, we don't have it at all, we don't even have it under development at this point in the stages of a project ongoing, then it might be a priority. And by priority score, what we're implying is that the attribute will be turned into projects. And if it's a burning platform issue, something very, very important to the company, we want to give it a red. And a red means that the capability the attribute refers to is definitely needed, and the projects to start within the next 2 years. All other projects that fall out of essentially this attribute assessment would be blue. So we would rate the attribute blue. The capability the attribute refers to is indeed needed, but the projects associated with that attribute that would come out of it in terms of making it a blue would mean that the projects would not have to start within 2 years. Okay, now what if you don't want it to turn into a project and you don't have a capability in that particular attribute? Well, that would mean one thing and one thing only. That would mean that your attribute is irrelevant. And if it's irrelevant, then we give it a black color coding, which means the capability does not apply to the organization. So let's look at priority scores first. Now, if you're going to assign a priority score to an attribute, that assumes the capability score has already been assessed to be 0. In other words, we don't have that capability whatsoever. It also assumes that we are not deeming that attribute as irrelevant. And in fact, it's further from being irrelevant than any other type of attribute there can be if you give it a 5. So a value of 5 is the highest priority attribute. I like to call it the burning platform projects. In other words, we need these projects to maintain our competitive capability, or else we risk even going out of business, or certainly losing a tremendous amount of business. So we need to start these projects within the next 2 years. Below a 5 are multiple shades of gray, or blue in this case, I guess fits better, where essentially our priority is much lower as we start to go down from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. And we actually classify this based upon years that we want to start that particular project. So at a level of 4, it's a fairly high priority, but it's not a burning platform. So it could start after the burning platform projects in year 3. Jumping all the way down to 1, we've given that one the lowest priority possible. We like the project, and it's something we believe is important for the future, but we're not going to start that project until after 5 years into the future, if ever. And I've added on 0 there just to remind everybody that the attribute may be irrelevant. Or essentially a 0 value is given to as a priority score associated with that attribute if indeed there is a positive value for the capability score. When we run this through a computer-based system, for example, for processing the chart scores, what we do is we assign each attribute score 2 different values. One is the priority score and one is the capability score. So if there's a positive capability score, then that priority score should be made 0. Conversely, what you see below at the bottom of the screen, if the priority score is a positive value, then the capability score must be a 0. Similarly, we can look at capability scores. A 5 that's green means we are very comfortable with this particular attribute in terms of its implementation, the capability being within our organization. And then the shades of gray start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and then down to 0, the same way we saw with the priority scores. Now I've got an example coming up to explain a little bit more about the idea of percentage of implementation. Now, just another point though before we move on is if the capability score is greater than 0, then the priority score must be 0. Okay, so let's revisit the previous example. And in fact, I left the picture of the young, beautiful girl on this slide to jog your memory that we had seen this one before. Now, with respect to this, we have different attributes listed from various charts within the world-class management step charts. Let's take a look at one of these here, in particular the total cost of ownership. Now, the total cost of ownership is not measured very well within organizations across the globe. Certainly the greatest amount of measurement of total cost of ownership is in the United States. And with that, it's all pretty much within private enterprise. And in fact, I had several teams while I was a professor at the University of San Diego that made their project essentially measurement of total cost of ownership as integrated within report cards. So that's partly where this attribute made it into, I believe it came from the proactive step of world-class cost management. So suppose that a company has 10 different report cards they utilize within their organization with suppliers. I mean, actually, I shouldn't say different report cards. Maybe it's the same type of report card, but for 10 different companies that they work with. Okay? So out of that 10, how many utilize the total cost of ownership in the report card? Well, to get 20%, the obvious answer to that would be 2. So if 2 companies out of the 10 utilize total cost of ownership, and all 10, it makes sense for them to be able to implement total cost of ownership, or it's logical that we could expand this best practice out to all 10, then 20% fits for the attribute score in this case. So 20% is 1, if you recall, on the scale of 1 to 5. Similarly, we could look at forecast error being reconciled. Now, suppose the same company is doing this assessment and they have built into their forecast systems a reconciliation feature that generates a report every time a forecast, perhaps maybe quarterly forecasts, are generated. Before they generate the forecast, their next set of forecasts, they go back and they reconcile their previous forecasts to determine could they improve the model, for example, or is there error in their model. Now let's take a look at a blue. Now keep in mind, a blue is a project priority, and it's given a priority score. So in this case, customer orders are automatically modify the schedules. With respect to this, the company has determined that this is an important attribute that they would like to develop the capability for. Now, to develop that capability, though, they see this as a relatively long-term effort, and maybe there's some additional attributes that have to be developed previous to this one to be able to occur. That would be a logical assumption given the fact that modifying schedules and having customer orders merge in with that is going to be a fairly intensive IT exercise. So the company also doesn't believe this is a burning platform issue, so they give it a blue rating of 2 to 3 years, which would be a 4 on the scale of 1 to 5 for project priority scores. Now let's take a look at an irrelevant. Perhaps a company does not do design. They don't touch designs at all. Well, if they don't touch designs at all, then the producer's life cycle costs are estimated in the product design stage really does not apply to them. Now this is where we get into some sticky situations as we get into the audit phase, or audit process I should say. It's not a phase. The audit process comes after the score process. When a company deems that something is irrelevant, one thing we try to make sure is that our registrars dig into the irrelevant associations with the attribute scores, because there are many situations where management had thought this was irrelevant, but when you start to think about the particular attribute, it often will end up applying. Now, a company that doesn't do design might actually need to develop this capability of injecting producer lifecycle costs into the design stage, but it may not be their design stage, it may be their customers. And in fact, if you're going to get the producer's lifecycle costs and you are the producer, even though you don't do design, you better darn well be thinking about getting into the design process of your customers. Anyway, let's continue. Now I wanted to bring up a red. This is a burning platform issue. And in fact, it often is when you look at the actual attribute here. The demand manager provides a single contact point for forecasts. In fact, what might throw this into being a burning platform issue is if the company doesn't even have a demand manager, which the term demand manager is one that really came up about, oh gosh, I'd say only about 6-7 years ago. And I didn't hear when I would go into companies of there even being the title of demand manager, and now that's become a relatively best practice. But even if you had one, if they weren't the single point of contact for forecasts, then you've got an issue here that is a best practice that could be resolved. Now, actually, a burning platform one in this case, changing the demand manager to being a single point of contact, may take very little resources and could be done relatively quickly by just changing policies. Pull system adjusts forecasts as needed in the next 2 years. Now, I'm not going to talk about all these. I think you're getting the idea. Company diversity policies, for example, being rated at a 40%. That's just a count. Where are diversity policies implemented? Maybe we have 5 divisions and we only have 2 of the divisions that actually have implemented diversity policies. Let's take a look at an attribute score input table. And this is the easiest way we found to be able to input actual scores for attributes. Let's let E equal to an existing capability, N be a needed capability, and I be irrelevant. Well, based upon categorization, first of all, into one of these 3 buckets, we can then identify the score that would be associated with that particular attribute. So the status, if you look at the middle column in this particular table, shows E, N, or I. So if we look at the first attribute, the driver gave an E as the existing capability for total cost of ownership being measured internally. And the driver also gave a score of 5 associated with that. So by these 2 inputs, what we know right now is we know that the capability score is equal to 5, but we also know that the priority score is equal to 0 for that particular attribute. The color coding helps in terms of somebody who's putting in the data and information and somebody who's actually going to be utilizing it to quickly be able to visually focus in on what are the things that are most important to that particular person at that particular point in time. It might be identifying some capabilities that we want to try to improve upon that we already have, so they'd focus in on the yellows. If it's something, for example, like that we want to identify projects that should go into our portfolio immediately, then I would say you need to prioritize around the reds, which are the burning platform projects. So how do these different scores for the attributes actually roll up? Well, they roll up essentially into what we call step scores, and then into chart scores, and then the attribute scores apply to the drive scores themselves, or organizational scores. But it all starts with the attribute being rated and assessed and scored, and then moving that into essentially a step score. So world-class management step charts have 4 steps. They have a clerical, mechanical, proactive, and world-class. A step score itself is associated with each step, and this step score ranges from 0 to 2.5. Step scores combine to create the chart score, which ranges from 0 to 10. So, therefore, if 2.5 is 25% of 10, that means that each step contributes 25% to the total chart score, or equal percentage. Let's take a look at calculating a chart score. Suppose we have 8 relevant attributes in a step that have all been scored. And in fact, you can look at the score associated with each attribute by the color coding and the actual value given inside of the circle. The step fraction is equal to the sum of the yellow attribute values plus the green attribute values. In other words, the total value we've given to our capabilities that exist, and dividing that by the full possible capability score we could have if all of our projects were completed and all of our yellows became green. So in other words, all the relevant attributes would be in the denominator times 5. Now when I say all the relevant attributes, we're counting them. So the way that this would look in terms of putting the numbers in would be in the numerator, we would have 2 plus 4, which refers to the yellow attributes, plus 5 plus 5, which refers to the green attributes, the capabilities, in other words. In the denominator, we have 5 times the sum of the count of all of the attributes that are relevant in the step. So if you recall, there were 8. So 5 times 8. Now we take the step fraction and we continue the calculations, and we get 16 divided by 40, which essentially is 40%. So how do we go from step score to chart score? Well, the step score is the step fraction times 2.5. So from our previous example of 40% for the fraction of the capability that we had of all the relevant attributes within that particular step, that 40% times the maximum value we could get out of that step, which is 25% of 10 or 2.5, we multiply these together and the product gives us 1. The chart score itself is the summation of all 4 step scores. So let's make an assumption that the step score we just calculated was for the proactive step. Okay, so let's take a look now at the step scores as they combine into the chart score. Suppose for the clerical score we've calculated a 2.1. Similarly for mechanical step we have a 1.8. And the proactive step score, as we already know from the previous slide, is a 1.0. And the world-class step is a 0.4. Now, you will notice that when you do this assessment within your organization that the scores on the steps tends to decrease as you move towards world-class. Now, the chart score then is the summation of these 4 values, which essentially is 5.3. The organization is scored as proactive for the core competency because they have broken the threshold of 4.99 to arrive at 5 or higher. Had they broken the threshold at 7.49 to get 7.5 or higher, then they would be designated as world class. Chart scores combine to create a single organizational score, which is called the DRIVE score. And here we have an example I've brought up before, so I won't spend any time on it, but essentially a calculation of the DRIVE score of 6.05. A little more interesting is how we roll up DRIVE scores. As an example of how the DRIVE score can be rolled up into summary scores for enterprises, mergers, acquisitions, alliances, chains, and even regions, let's consider how a chain score might be calculated. So we could use the same methodology for the other approaches if we'd like. A chain is kind of useful though because of the fact that we could look at something like this where we've got 5 key alliance firms that are part of chain ABC, a hypothetical chain, to provide a product to customers. They decide to combine their individual DRIVE scores into a chain score. So how do we go about calculating this chain score? Well, there are several options we could possibly use. Among them are the following: average the DRIVE score, where all firms have an equal weight. This is kind of a silly idea unless the actual companies involved are very similar in scale and size. In any case, B is a little better, and that's weighting each firm's contribution to the chain through some sort of a negotiation, and then summing the weighted drive scores based upon these weights. A couple other approaches would be weighting the scores by an annual revenue of the companies involved, so we actually get the scale of the companies. There are pitfalls with all of these approaches. Let's take a look at this one here, which is weighting the scores by the percentage of each firm's value added. And once again, we're getting into some kind of an ambiguous area here, because how do you define what value added is? We're going to take a very simple approach. Let's do a chain contribution calculation. Weight the firms on their contribution to chain value. Let's assume first, though, that the contribution can be measured as the price that organizations in the chain are willing to pay for goods and services. I'm always reminded by my realtor when I would ask him, for example, what do you think the value of my house is if I were to sell it? And the answer would always be, it's whatever somebody will pay. So a price is a good way to actually determine the value of what it is that you've done with respect to the materials or services that you're going to be selling to a potential customer or another entity within your supply chain. So the last organization in a chain, in this case, is the customer. And there could be multiple customers, not just one. So let's look at firm A chain contribution and calculate what that is. Essentially, that would be the drive score times firm A's selling price to firm B. This is assuming that we do not have any materials and so forth that are coming into firm A that we have to subtract off that price. And then we would divide that by the price to the final customer. It's easier to put numbers to things here. So suppose that firm A is able to sell some product to firm B. That same product goes into or is improved upon in some way or another such that firm B can sell that to firm C. Some more added value occurs between firm C and D in terms of something maybe that is modification that firm C is able to bring to the table, and the same thing again from firm D to firm E. So added value is added at every point along the way within this particular chain. The final customer perhaps pays $1 million, which again shows that there is added value from firm E going to essentially the customer. Okay, so let's take a look at this in terms of taking the selling price from the previous slide and just injecting it into the second column of this particular table. Now, firm A had a selling price of $210,000 to firm B. The value they added, because they didn't actually have any materials and so forth that they had to buy to be able to produce this added value product, which probably is untrue, but let's assume it for this example, their value add was $210,000. Now, we can't calculate the actual percentage at this point because we need to continue with the example to find out what the customer actually was able to, we were able to get out of the customer from firm E in terms of the price. And in fact, jumping down, why don't we take a look at that? We have $210,000 for the value add of firm A, and then $1 million essentially is the price that firm E was able to get out of the customer. So we can take every value that we calculate in terms of the value added, divide by 1 million, and we will get the percentage in the far right column. So for firm A, it's 210,000 divided by 1 million gives us 21%. Okay, so let's take that 21% for firm A and let's carry it forward into our example of the actual contribution of firm A to the chain's value, in this case chain ABC. So we had a final score for firm A of 6.05, and we know that 21% is their contribution of value. So if we take the 6.05 times 21%, we end up with a value of 1.27. If we repeat this same calculation for each of the firms associated with this particular chain, and we account for the weight applied to their score, then we can come up with a chain score. So chain ABC score is 1.27 for firm A, plus the contribution modification to the firm score for each of the other organizations or companies that are part of this particular chain. So that summation comes out to 5.19, which, once again, an observation, 5.19 puts this particular company or chain rather into the proactive state. Now what we can do with these chain metrics is over time we could take and compare how we are doing against our targets every year for our progress towards world class. For example, maybe our first year is indeed just above 5.0 for our particular chain in terms of the chain score. But maybe as a collaborative chain, we decide, let's try to get to just shy of 7.0, maybe 6.9. And if we indeed measure every year, then we can discover how far we have progressed. Now, in this case, for second year of trying to reach close to 7, the chain failed in that effort based upon their measurements in year 2. However, in year 3, they exceeded their expectations in their forecasts of what they wanted to try to achieve. And in fact, for years 3, 4, and 5, we can see the little X below the red lines that are connecting to form an arrow pointing upward for the chain's capability. Okay, so let's get back on track now and discuss the other 4 phases within the score process. Up to now, we've been describing detail associated with how we go about scoring and how do we calculate the chart scores and then the actual drive scores, which are related to essentially the score phase, the very first phase. So let's now go into consensus and discuss how reviewers will rate the attribute scores and thereby influence the final score through ratings and discussions. Now we have another input chart, essentially, where in this case we have the reviewers that are putting in ratings on the attribute scores. So the different types of ratings that they can give are down to essentially a very easy to diagnose and think through 3 different categories of rating. The first is to reject the score outright, to completely disagree with what the driver did in terms of assigning a score to a given attribute. The second choice is to stay neutral on it. You have some reservations. You don't fully accept the score, but you are not necessarily going to fight it tooth and nail also. So you think it may be somewhat accurate. Now, A is you accept the score outright. You have no reservations about what the driver gave to that attribute in terms of the actual score. The ratings in the right-hand column of the figure utilize the traffic stoplight colors, which is a theme throughout the drive literature and initiative. So after multiple rating reviews have occurred on each of the different attributes, an average rating can be calculated for each attribute. And I want to make sure I note that reviewers cannot change the scores. This actually has to be the drivers who change scores. Reviewers only give ratings. Now, looking at the third attribute down, we can see that the rating given by this particular reviewer is an agree. And in fact, we can see the green symbolism there, that it's green for moving ahead. Now, the actual attribute score is shown as a blue 2. So it is a priority score for a project to occur, but it's not anywhere near being a burning issue project. And in fact, it can be done 4 years out. In a similar way, looking down at the very bottom attribute, we can see that the reviewer has completely rejected the assumption of that the attribute is 100% capability for the organization as given by the driver in the score phase. So now when we have a lot of reds and yellows in terms of the ratings, we're going to end up with a situation where we have very low consensus of the reviewers, and the driver will need to have discussions with these reviewers in terms of should we change the actual score. Now keep in mind on the previous slide that we said that a red rating, a rejection, would be given a 0 value. Similarly, an N was a 1 value, and an A for agree was a 2.0. What we want to do next is calculate a consensus index. A consensus occurs if the average rating for the attribute is 1.5 or higher. In other words, a consensus threshold has been met, and the attribute score that was given is considered to be a good one, that we have consensus associated with it. The consensus index for an attribute is simply the sum of the ratings divided by the number of the ratings times 2.0. And we'll look at an example here in a minute. The consensus index is presented as a percentage, and this percentage can be rolled up to a chart consensus index, an attribute consensus index, and even an alliance or chain consensus index. So let's look at an example. Suppose we have 4 reviewers, and half of the reviewers give a green light of 2 points each, and half a yellow light of 1 point each. The attribute score passes with a 1.5 average. Also, the attribute has a consensus index of 75%. In other words, we could look at the calculation. We had 4 reviewers. 2 of them gave 2 points and 2 of them gave 1 point. So we've got 2 plus 2 plus 1 in the numerator. Divide that by 8 possible points. So 6 divided by 8 essentially is 75%, or 0.75. Now we move from the consensus phase to the optimized phase. So the consensus phase is actually done by the reviewers independent of each other. At the optimized phase, though, they come together in discussion and dialogue with the other reviewers and also with the driver. And this is where we can focus in on the different attributes that had rejected attribute scores. In other words, their consensus index based upon the ratings by the reviewers was very low. What we mean by optimize is that the best possible consensus is given to the attribute score. So in the optimize, in the discussion, if the driver decides based upon the discussion that I need to change this and put in a new score for that attribute, then the consensus index for that attribute is automatically reset to 100%, the highest level possible. After the optimize phase, essentially we are done with scoring the charts. We can move to the review phase, where the driver publishes the chart report with the key contents of the following: high priority projects and future projects. Now, we haven't actually decided upon projects at this point. What we've decided upon is we need to be able to improve upon some given attributes which can be transformed into specific projects. Now, an attribute like measurement of total cost of ownership across a chain would require multiple projects, not just one. So that's why we specify here, although we talk about these as being high priority projects, what we've done essentially is rated that attribute very, very high. In the chart report also is a statistical summation of all the current capabilities and the emerging capabilities. And this is useful to be able to see where we're at with the emerging capabilities, but also where we've been in terms of our improvements in place and that we're leveraging currently, which would be the green current capabilities. The chart report now becomes part of the score report. Let's take a look at an example of an aerospace score report. Most score reports have some sort of an executive summary, and also they'll have some summary statistics immediately after. What I like the best, and what most people seem to like the best, is shown on the right hand side, which is a navigation wheel. With one picture we can see where we are in terms of our actual chart scores and our drive score if we were to list it, which it isn't in this particular figure. What are the burning platform projects we have within each of the core competencies, and then what are the projects we'd like to develop into the future. Then the next part of the report covers the highest priority opportunities. Then after that, we essentially just lump in together the different chart reports for all of the different charts that were assessed by a given organization. And that essentially forms the score report. It's pretty straightforward once we have the chart reports in place. Now we come to the engage phase, the last phase of the score process. At this point, the unofficial score report may be shared within the organization. And the organization is able to what we call engage through transferring the unofficial score report to the audit process, the roadmap process, and the robust process. Now, you'll note here we haven't used this term up to this point, but we're calling the score report out of the score process the unofficial score report. And the reason for that is because score report does not become official according to the Roadmaps Institute until it has gone through and been vetted in the audit process, and it becomes registered with the Roadmaps Institute. Now, some companies may choose to not go through the audit process. I highly recommend it because the idea is to remove the bias of managers and the potential for gaming in terms of putting in higher scores perhaps where they don't actually have a capability. Just the knowledge that whatever they do in terms of their scoring will end up going into an audit process will usually keep people essentially honest in their score assessments and their ratings. In conclusion, the SCORE process is designed to assess organizations on one or more world-class management step charts. The standard has become 10 charts, as articulated or illustrated by the aerospace defense industry model. The assessments result in discovery of gaps between current and world-class state. And these gaps are closed by organizations through selecting capabilities that they will improve upon in the coming years. To develop the capabilities, projects are developed and networked together and are created into, or at least loaded into, what we call roadmaps. We can learn more about these roadmaps in the roadmap process and the robust process. Please refer to these presentations provided later.